So we've got 3 talks here for this before the break. We're in session 3, uses and needs for climate information for coastal resource management. These 3 talks are going to drill down with a couple of examples of how we're linking at the coastal interface and some of our climate signals. So our first talk is Michelle Gierach from NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Life at the Edge, Science and Applications Needs at Coastal Interface.
Okay, so pop quiz, what do you think I'm going to talk about, right? NASA JPL, I'm kidding. Spaceborne remote sensing, right? So like the Great Lakes, we exist, we're here, please don't forget about us, right? I'm hoping that I can sort of dangle a carrot, sort of make a plug that illustrates that when we think about sort of this coastal observing system, let's not forget about how satellites maybe could help, right? Help fill in the spatial and temporal gaps. And maybe it's not sufficient right now, but what are the gaps that you currently are experiencing so that we can plan the next version of a coastal observing system from space? So at JPL, we've been doing sort of a lot of thinking on this as we prepare for the 2027 Decadal Survey, which is sort of our marching orders for what our next missions will be, huge flagship missions. So when we think about that, like what are the grand challenges? Coast. I think everybody in this room realizes coast is one of those grand challenges. So we've been looking at the existing program of record, what it can and cannot do. Also, what's been talked about here a lot, interfacing with the stakeholders, right? Finding out exactly what they need and trying to sort of co-design a mission formulation that meets the requirements and needs. And then, planning the next version. So hopefully, maybe you'll see a satellite in 2040, 2050. And maybe that's like a slow burn, long game, but unfortunately that's how we play. So I think we all see things like this on a regular, right? From scientific papers to obviously news releases such as this. We know coasts are impacted. We know it's changing with respect to climate change and increasing in frequency. And a lot of these issues that we're experiencing are huge for our human livelihood and the ecosystems that support them. So again, what we take a deep dive look at is, does our existing program of record meet these requirements and the things that we're experiencing? Short answer, no, from our perspective. So we'll get into that. And then what do we need to build that can actually really tackle these? And as I mentioned in the past, we've been really great at doing scientific discovery, providing products. I would go and talk to people and stakeholders here, we're talking local. So that might be City of LA, California, City of LA, then to more regional, being like county level or even state to federal, right? And we would go to the City of LA and be like, here, look at this awesome land surface temperature product. This can help you. And they're like, what can I do with that, right? It just wasn't, so we weren't really translating. So now we're trying to bring them into the loop to really co-develop with them. So aside, we'll tell you sort of assessment of the existing sort of program of record, where we sort of see it could go with respect to coast. So what do we mean by coast? So I think historically, as we're sort of seeing here, right, we generally break this up into pieces. So for us, we really feel sort of the fun challenge, dare mighty things, try and do the complex, is really looking at the coast as a whole, right? Not cutting it off of the land to sea and saying terrestrial hydrologists are going to worry about that. The terrestrial ecologists for the mangroves and wetlands, or even just, what we've been talking about here, more the land to sea component, but thinking about it all together, right? Even if we're designing a coastal observing system, talking about putting out moorings or AUVs or disruptive technologies that we need to have that are low cost for sort of spanning this environment, you have to still have an understanding of what the needs are upstream and how it's all connected, right? So you can't sort of, without thinking of the total picture. So we're thinking about the total picture and how we can actually combine all these different things, looking at land to sea and sea to land drivers for the impacts at the coast. So drivers here, right, being sea level rise, weather extremes, we've heard all these things so far, human dimensions, so that being, land cover, land use change, urbanization, as well as ocean warming and acidification. I think those are all things that we've heard in this room the last couple of days. It also appears, and basically that was a meta assessment, ChatGPT dump of all the documents that exist out there. What are the key things that we're experiencing now that we will continue to experience in the 2040, 2050 realm, those drivers? And then what are some potential impacts at the coast that are really those that are most pressing so far? And I think we've heard of several of these so far, but just illustrating them here, right? There's also ones associated with biodiversity and biodiversity change at the coast, but I think we've heard everything here so far. So what can our existing program of record do? Take what you're seeing here, a grain of salt. I could not find a good graphic, so I generated this very quickly. So there are some caveats, maybe not all the information is correct. The one takeaway I want you to get is basically at this region here, which are those that are most relevant for society, societal scale implications, we really don't have any observations that meet those, right? For here, 2 examples, sea level rise and water quality. So we're missing that key gap. The other thing that Camille had brought up was with respect to sort of, Uwe brought up with respect to rapid response. Another thing we need to consider as well that we've been taking a harder look at, even if you have an observation up there, can you provide the data latency and provide that product in a timely enough manner for them to enact change or make some kind of informed decision in management? I think that's something we also have to think about. How quickly can we do the turnaround to provide that information? So all those things together. So point being, existing program of record does not work for our definition of coast. And then you might see, okay, Aquaterra, if we're saying temporal, you're talking in the order of a day. Glimmer, which is an upcoming mission that's going to launch in about 2025, 26, will have, I think it's subdaily, it's diurnal. However, with ocean color sensors, we have a problem with clouds. So, are you really getting that? We'll see. But aside, in the grand scheme of things, sort of our paradigm shift we've been having at NASA, we now have this NASA Earth Science to Action strategy. So the idea being, taking it the full level, not necessarily the last mile, but actually incorporating a lot of the stakeholder sort of engagement and feedback to co-develop, co-design. So, in the past, we've basically just been data, period. That bottom foundation, and we still are. That's the foundation of everything. But really now, how do we generate information and knowledge that the stakeholders, the informed decision makers, the management, conservation, adaptation can actually directly take and do something with for that wisdom, which is generally some kind of policy or strategy. So I'm going to walk you through an example. This is all HAB centric. I love HABs, harmful algal blooms off the West Florida shelf. You have the typical standard Modus Aqua, which is mainly used, the normalized fluorescent light height product. You also have one that we sort of exploited and explored if it could be applicable, Tropomi. Tropomi is mainly used for atmospheric, but we realized it had a similar sort of fluorescence of solar-induced fluorescence. So we decided to investigate how well this could be used. The difference being Modus is a sort of multispectral, so it has these broadband channels. Tropomi is more like an imaging spectrometer, so it gets a lot more finer information, which allows us to really use more of the data, or more data exists. And what you're seeing here is basically a heat map for each pixel, how many number of days are observed from either Tropomi or Modus for August 2018, which was when a massive harmful algal bloom happened from August to October in this region. And what you can hopefully pick from this, and I wish I had shown another graphic which illustrates it a lot more, Modus has a lot of implications with respect to clouds, so you don't get a lot of information returned. Tropomi, on the other hand, doesn't have the same sensitivities, therefore we get more days of observation, which can help from an informed management decision as to if they're trying to decide where in fact to deploy assets, so financial implications, so that thing. So aside, each one of these instruments alone can do something. And we could just, here's a map. I don't know what they could actually do with that, right? Maybe some things, but can we take it the next level? Can we actually fuse that, use some kind of data machine learning type approaches to produce something that they maybe really can just take and run with, like harmful algal bloom severity maps? So we actually had a little pilot. Again, don't take this, it's sort of hand wavy right now. But what you have overlaid, in fact, is the red dots or the in situ harmful algal bloom cell counts that were collected. What we have in the background and the colors illustrate where in fact the severity map or the machine learning approach detected where in fact a harmful algal bloom could have been. And it's basically a combination of Tropomi and Modus Aqua. So in short, it illustrates if this is true, again, we have not validated anything here, but if this is in fact true, it sort of illustrates we could have deployed assets in different regions, contrary to where in fact they were sort of collected. So perhaps we were missing a lot of the signal. And this can be used, right, by EPA, NOAA, et cetera. So sort of taking that next step of sort of that wisdom. So what is this all leading up to? Point takeaway. Existing program of record we feel is insufficient. So what kind of observation system do we need? And we need to be discussing that now to really prime the pump for the next decadal survey. So again, this is really NASA's marching orders for these big missions that will give you the information, hopefully that can supplement your amazing coastal ocean observing systems that we're talking about. So I sort of mentioned this yesterday, maybe I'm being disruptive, but we've been thinking long and hard about it. You can't observe everything all at once at the same time. There's just nobody has the funds for that right now. So if we are thinking for a satellite observation or system in 2040, 2050, and that's realistic, right? What are the key challenges that we're going to face at the coast that are societally relevant? And therefore, what observations do we need to prioritize that those spaceborne assets would look at? I know it's sort of a shift, right? We sort of want to, I want to look at everything as a scientist, but understanding it, that may not be the right approach. So in that term, we've sort of been thinking about a framework. All this is very drafty. I'm here to try and engage you guys, hopefully join, please. We would love to have one like community consensus that's for the coast that's being put into this RFI for the decadal survey, which will probably happen about 2025. But in thinking about sort of a framework that connects that coast as a whole, land to sea to land impacts at the coast. Again, going back to the point, why do we care about coast? It's where we live. We want to make it habitable. We want it to stay. So how habitable is it now? And I think if you looked at specific science disciplines, you know that mangrove, the extent, how that's changing, sea level, but not combining it all together, right? So is there some way that we can sort of look at this as a whole and teaser habitability is probably the not right word. I full disclosure, liability, habitability is probably not right. I think vulnerability, sustainability, whatever you want. But the point being, what is that today using all the different observations we have at the coast to sort of define some kind of metric, and how might it be in the future, knowing that sea level rise, weather extremes, ocean warming and acidification, and their compound are going to continue again in that 2040, 2050 realm. So we thought about it in 3 different themes. All these are sort of grounded in the United Nations SDGs. The first one being more related to sea level, and I would say extreme events. And that's, you know, why do we care at the coast? The impacts to infrastructure and how in fact we might have to migrate or relocate whole communities, right? So if that's the wisdom you're trying to get to or the policy, then what are sort of the main sort of knowledge that you would need to generate, right? So that's saying changes in flooding extent, surface landscape change, then therefore drilling down. So we're going top to bottom, but you can also go bottom up. You know, then what are the observables you would need? And then what are the requirements? And again, this is very drafty. This is based upon our existing sort of stakeholder engagement that we've had with the NASA Sea Level Change Science team, such as Phil and others. And then obviously specific stakeholders like how we have in California. But again, we would like to expand it and get more inputs from you guys. So I know I've been harassing a few people about like, what assessments do you have? What surveys? That's sort of all leading into here because we want to really make it informed. So first, vulnerability measured by impacts to infrastructure, human migration relocation. Next one, if we're at the coast, people want to live there, do we actually have access and availability to fresh water? Right, saltwater intrusion, things like this are happening. We need to have water to survive. You need water health. You also need water security. So here, thinking about, you know, again, the whole thing, you need to have understanding of the distribution of water and what's in that water coming down. You need to have an understanding of how that freshwater, salt water is basically laterally moving at the surface as well as the subsurface. You also need to know what the quality of that water is, as well as the constituents within it. So thinking about contaminants. And then again, observables, requirements. And last one, you need food, right? Food security. So here we need to really have a good understanding of the diversity of the ecosystems, both aquatic and terrestrial. Biodiversity is sort of the metric for us of life. So thinking about the extent, composition, and or physiology of the vegetative ecosystem, so the mangroves. Thinking about the shallow benthic communities like coral reefs, as well as the coastal phytoplankton blooms themselves, their distribution, you know, how many are harmful or not, and that sort of goes on and on. So high level view. Sorry, I've been talking a lot. I get very excited about this, so happy to chat more after. So main takeaways, I just want to reiterate, it's really land to sea, sea to land. And I understand if we're carving off a piece, but let's not forget, we need to also be in our purview, thinking about what that land to sea contribution would be for the entire coast. The existing spaceborne program may not be sufficient. Satellite continuity is not a given. So some people have said, oh, satellites will do that. You can't count on that. We have to make strong pitches every year to retain the satellites and the observations we have, and working with NOAA to continue these types of observations. So period, you know, so please provide us with that inputs, and hopefully satellites, I convinced you or not, maybe we can talk offline, that we really would like to sort of consider satellites as part of this coastal observing system. to really fill in these spatial temporal gaps. And then we can really lean on the existing program of record to define the next. So, SWOT, if you guys haven't heard of SWOT, we can talk more about that, or PACE, some of the things it's going to be doing with respect to phytoplankton community composition is unparalleled. And then, as we all know, in a cost-constrained world, which we really are in and will continue to likely be in, we probably need to prioritize what observations we need to be going after. And for us, it's really thinking about those that are, scientifically, but then also have societal relevance, what happens now as well as that in the future. So, I was pithy here. It was late. I had a couple of drinks. But aside, Uncle Sam, Michelle Gierach says, we need you. So we really need you guys to really tell us a little bit more as to, for your specific stakeholders, for Natalie's talking about sort of for the marine sanctuaries, what are they telling you that they need? Perhaps they're even looking at satellite observations and they're saying this is insufficient or they need a certain product. Please, we need that information. We really want to sort of do this meta assessment that compiles together everything. And we would love your help and support and join sort of our spaceborne asset for coasts. So yeah, that's it.
Move over to Jacob Steinberg, NOAA GFDL, will tell us about a link between US East Coast sea level rise and offshore ocean heat uptake.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give this talk. I am a research scientist at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton, New Jersey. I'm a physical oceanographer by training. And today I'm going to give a bit more of a science talk, maybe, compared to what we've seen over yesterday and today. And it reflects some of the work that I've done over the past few years and is an example, I think, of using models and observations to link the open ocean, say, climate signal to the coast. So the talk, I'll eventually get to this, a link between US East Coast sea level rise and offshore ocean warming. I'll get there eventually, but first I wanted to kind of step my way in and show a figure that you have probably seen before that shows in a global mean sense how sea level is rising and what the contributions to that time series are. So the black or the grayish time series represents our satellite altimeter measurements, again, of global mean sea level rise since the start of the altimeter era. And the blue line represents the contribution effectively to that from the addition of water to the oceans. That is the melting of ice sheets or just the loss of terrestrial water storage. And the reddish line is the contribution to global mean sea level rise from thermal expansion. That is, water becomes warmer, it's less dense, takes up more space, and sea level rises. And when you add the two together, you get the purple line, which I think it's pretty remarkable that we have these independent observing systems and measurement platforms that can agree and tell us kind of what we're seeing and get at under the surface why it's happening. So this is all global mean, but as you may guess, there are spatial and temporal patterns in these processes. So do I advance my slide? Yes. Okay, so this is now, I quickly made these figures a few days ago. These are still observation-derived maps where the right panel is showing the spatial patterns of ocean mass change effectively. This is from the GRACE gravimetry satellite mission. And so this is a trend. I've decided to focus for now on interannual variability. I'm plotting a 10-year trend of the mass contribution, or we call manometric sea level change from GRACE. And you can see these spatial patterns where the trends are larger in some places and smaller in others. And the lower panel shows similar maps, same trends over the same time period, but from in situ Argo-derived measurements of density change. So we get sea level rise from warming or cooling, warming or cooling, we'll call sea level fall, and you can see these spatial patterns that they're in of climate modes that we're familiar with. This is particularly over the upper 2,000 meters, the depth range over which Argo samples. But so what I'm interested in is effectively relating these two ideas of how mass moves around, particularly redistributes, and how it can be linked to density-driven changes in the ocean. So to consider that, the first thing I do is, now I'm plotting the same fields again, but the lower panel is the same, but the upper panel is now mass trends, but having removed a global mean. So now we're looking at how water is redistributing and potentially in response to changes in density and ocean circulation. And so if I remove a majority of the ocean from this upper panel and particularly focus on the coast, I want to ask the question, can we relate near coast mass-driven sea level change, which reflects a dominant fraction of the sea level change that we observe at the coast? It's mostly water moving in or coming out. It's not warming or cooling because relatively the shelf is so shallow compared to offshore. Can we relate that to the lower panel, which are these density-driven changes? And so some of this work was inspired by making these two maps and looking visually at the correspondence between, it might be hard to see because I've not zoomed in on a particular area, but there are regions in which coastal sea level rise, this mass-driven term, is co-located with offshore density-driven change. And so from a process level or perspective, I'm interested in relating the two. So this has all been observations, but now I will switch to some modeling analysis because we can do things with models that we can't with observations, and we want to leverage each to take advantage of their strengths. So now I'm going to zoom into the US East Coast and start to talk about analysis I've done with a model that we developed at GFDL. But first, I thought for those that are unfamiliar, I could offer a little context of what we do at GFDL, particularly in the ocean division where I'm a member. So in this division, we build regional and global simulations, ocean simulations that range from, quote, high resolution, a 25th of a degree, up to 1 degree climate scale. We run ocean only, coupled atmosphere, ocean, and Earth system models in different modes, in like pre-industrial states or conditions, historical record, like retrospective runs, future scenarios. And particularly what I'm excited about is in our division, we're working to improve the representation of physics and processes relevant for sea level. So I think we're getting much closer now, and I've listed a few of our recent developments that some are complete, some are ongoing. In particular, we're developing an interactive ice sheet so that mass change can be in part, like the ocean can experience mass change due to ice sheet loss. Most climate models now, if not all, do not account for that physics. There might be meltwater fluxes that are prescribed. Another piece is running these simulations in the non-Boussinesq configuration, meaning ocean volume can change in response to warming or cooling or salinity change. In this model that I'm going to talk about, we have tides. We are soon to implement wetting and a dynamic land-ocean interface. And I can talk more about these if you're interested, but we're getting towards a more comprehensive set of representing a more comprehensive set of physical processes that let us answer the sea level related questions that we have. Okay, so back to my science question and kind of story that I want to tell. I'm zooming in the East Coast, and I'm showing the same two fields that I did from observations. The upper panel is how sea level is changing from a mass perspective via either addition or loss of mass to a given location. You can see light reds maybe on the US East Coast continental shelf south of Cape Hatteras. And the lower panel shows density-driven sea level change. That is warming over the subtropical North Atlantic. So you can ignore the Gulf Stream and the eddy signals in there. There's this broad patch of red that suggests over this time period that the subtropical North Atlantic is warming. And so again, I'm investigating this relationship between offshore warming and coastal sea level rise that I assess through this mass-driven component or mass-driven term in the sea level budget. And so I introduced this kind of simple idea and schematic. Maybe you've seen me talk about this before. This is again an attempt to relate these two fields. And imagine the ocean in cross-section is this kind of bathtub where we have three layers. The continental shelf and slope is on the left-hand side. Again, we have three layers, and we imagine if we warm the second of the three layers, we would go from panel A to panel B. We would induce the sea level change, right? As waters warm, they become less dense, sea level would rise. And then that would induce some adjustment process to get us to panel C, where sea level will have risen throughout the domain. And those pluses and minuses at the bottom indicate there will be a redistribution of mass. Those pluses are where the ocean would gain mass, and the minuses are where it would lose mass. This is all just due to warming some subsurface layer that does not span the full aerial extent of your imagined ocean. And so we can anticipate through this equation at the bottom how the coastal sea level should change in response to offshore warming. And particularly, where is that warming happening in the water column? Because if it happens in the uppermost layer, sea level will rise everywhere, but there will not be a redistribution of mass because there won't be any sea surface height gradient across some feature. So we evaluate that, and I won't tell the entire details of my story, but I relate that offshore density change to subtropical North Atlantic mode waters, upper ocean waters that are warming, and many papers that have come out in the past few years that assess this and try to determine whether or not it's due to surface fluxes or heat convergence, a change in the Gulf Stream or AMOC. But regardless of the driver, we can assess density change and estimate the coastal response. And that's effectively what these two time series are. The blue is the coastal sea level change averaged along the US East Coast south of Cape Hatteras. And then the orange is that predicted from this model that says, like, very crudely, we can assess how sea level is changing by just considering offshore density change. And so that treats the ocean as a bathtub, which it's not. And we have a Gulf Stream, right, that complicates all of this. And so some of the ongoing work that I'm doing tries to extend that to a more realistic stratification along the shelf and slope. And particularly, I've come upon, I think, an exciting new maybe variable that we should be thinking about, which is bottom density. That there's some theory that goes back to the 30s that says you can effectively anticipate coastal sea level change by integrating bottom density along the shelf and the slope to some depth offshore. And you can see in this schematic that depending on how far along the shelf and slope you go, you're connecting, so to speak, two water masses offshore. So quantifying offshore warming, finding where those isopycnals, those density surfaces, hit the coast, and evaluating this integral is a way or a framework that I've been thinking about for connecting, again, offshore to onshore. And so I did that kind of crudely in two steps. The first is I just picked two stations on the US East Coast, North New York on the left and South Carolina on the Charleston on the right. And I just correlate bottom density with those sea level at those locations. And what is striking to me is that in New York, you see this broad shelf connectivity. These blues are, they're negative correlations because as bottom density goes up, sea level goes down. It's an opposite signal, but you see this broad connectivity that follows the coastal waveguide. Whereas South Carolina on the right-hand side, you see this connectivity not to the immediate shelf, but to the slope and the shelf break. And again, this strikes me as an indicator of the connection to offshore and how there are spatial patterns in that connection. And so I don't know if I'm running out of time, but I, again, kind of constructed a simple test case where I built all these locations along the US East Coast, and I evaluate that integral of bottom density, and I compute skill in predicting coastal sea level. And the takeaway is that on the left-hand side, you see as a function of depth and distance offshore, skill at skill south of Cape Hatteras does not increase or approach 1 until you get off the shelf. Whereas north of Cape Hatteras, you see high skill values on the shelf. Thank you. So again, it's identifying regionally, there are these different processes at play that connect the ocean onshore versus offshore, and can link some of the things that we think about, right? Like, again, I was focusing on subtropical North Atlantic heat content, and through these ideas and theory that definitely still need development and consideration of the Gulf Stream's role in all of this, to the coast, to the coastal signal. So that is all I have. Just summarize, I would say as a reminder for those who don't think about this, the near coast sea level change reflects this local gain or loss of mass, but that we can use bottom pressure and bottom density to relate and to determine offshore connectivity and drivers of coastal sea level change. So at GFDL, I, along with others, am working to develop a framework to assess this globally, not just at the US East Coast, but it motivates monitoring of near coast fields that we currently think about. I would suggest adding to it temperatures and density as you move on the shelf and off into the slope, like offshore, so that we can anticipate, because there's some predictability at seasonal and longer timescales, we can anticipate changes on top of which these more extreme events occur that are maybe in our face more often, but we don't think about some of the lower frequency variability. So with that, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. And now moving on to Jan Newton, University of Washington, bringing a focus to the near shore, a case for refining projections to aid coastal communities.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And to be honest with you, I thought I was going to be using the bulk of my talk to make a case for a focus on the near shore. But we really heard from all of the breakout groups that you get that and that you share those concerns. Well, I'm still going to present the results from two projects that illustrate that really well, but also I want to emphasize the co-design and co-production process of the first study that I'll talk to you about today. So acknowledging my co-authors, who are a fantastic team, who really none of what I'm saying today would be possible without each and every one of them. All right, so the first study I want to talk about was funded by NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program through their emphasis on regional vulnerability assessments. This one is very place-based. It takes place on the Olympic coast of Washington State. Their call required an integrated social and ecological approach to this RVA, Regional Vulnerability Assessment, to ocean acidification. And that was incredibly wise because it produced a project that I think changed a lot of us natural scientists who weren't used to working with social scientists in a way that has deepened the meaning of our research and really added to the output that came from this. So we talk about co-design and co-production. Co-design is like writing that proposal together. And I want to emphasize that the names in the middle line there, they are all representatives of tribes. The Quinault Indian Nation, the Makah tribe, the Ho tribe, and the Quileute tribe. And they were there as co-PIs at the get-go. And I think that's critically important. So often scientists want to do good things. It's like, okay, here's an idea. You want this, right? And it's so important to co-design with the community members. The other thing is the co-production, and that will be really the rest of what I'm going to say here. We also really benefited by the fact that this took place in the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary and that they have data. Also the Olympic National Park, and they had data, as well as the NANUS IOOC funded Cheba buoy that has data and a model that existed that greatly enhanced what we could do in this study. So what did we do? All right, so this is, as I said, it's a place-based approach. It combines social science, natural science, but it was grounded in the community priorities. All right, one of the things that came out of this is just this picture. And if you had asked me to draw a picture of the ecosystem on the Olympic coast, I never would have had people in it. And that was a huge aha moment. There's people in our ecosystems, okay? You know, maybe I'm slow to catch on, but it was really important. And also those people who have been living on those shores since time immemorial, for millennia, have priorities on the organisms that feed them and are part of their cultural practices. And so what we were able to do, I know this is a bit of an eye test, but what I want to say is that what's key here is these steps. The green ones were ones we did all together, co-producing. The blue ones were the ones that the social scientist, Melissa Poe, led. And then the orange ones were the ones that the natural scientists did. So scoping, what is the environment you're going to think about? Understanding its social importance of the marine species, those ones I put the little yellow circles around, as well as analyzing variability and all the data that existed using Samantha Sedlecki's ocean forecast model that went out to the end of the century, and then looking at the frequency duration of harmful oceanographic events. And even though this was conceived as OA, we did it as a multiple stressors, so oxygen and temperature, and then together evaluating the risks to the ecosystem resources that are important to community partners. The rest of the wheel is getting that information back to the communities so that then they can decide what actions they want to take. And there's been some good actions that I just texted with Melissa about what they did, and I'll share that with you towards the end. So this was a nice process. All right, so just briefly, we synthesized the data. We found that it wasn't perfect, but we did our best. We focused on 4 focal species that have different life history patterns, but that razor clams, Dungeness crab, olive snails, and Pacific halibut all have a more of a benthic or deep sea or intertidal expression to their life history. And so we used Sam's model to assess present and future OA risks for bottom waters. And so here is Samantha's model. It's a CMIP-5 downscale to the regional ocean model, US UW Cascadia, that Parker McCready and Sam and others have developed, future projections for 2100. And then she further emphasized just the Olympic Coast region. And there you see all of the dots. They're either where those organisms are or they're where our monitoring assets are. And what's critical, a very critical step, is that we had to ask, how's that model going to do in the near shore, right? You know, these are ocean models that are getting downscale. And so we had a OA algorithm that Simone Allen did. The model output in the OA algorithm agreed plus or minus 20%. But we also had the ability to look in this onshore offshore gradient of these 3 assets. And let me expand that for you. So the pink thing is our Cheba buoy that John Mickett's the PI for here in the audience. Then those blue triangles are the sanctuary's own oceanographic moorings that they deploy. They have one at 42 meters, one at 15 meters, and then the brown is the Olympic National Park intertidal sensors. And so we were able to compare things along that trend. And here's what you see for temperature, salinity, and pH. The blue are during the upwelling season, the red are during the non-upwelling season. And I don't have time to go over this, but what I want you to get out of it is that in some cases there's some agreement, but there's also a lot of non-agreement, right? We looked at both surface data and we looked at bottom data, which was even worse depending on what you're looking at. All right, so do we see a correlation or trend between onshore and offshore observations? For temperature? It was decent. For Cheba, interestingly, during the non-upwelling season, it was better. For the sanctuary, yes, and just between 15-meter water depth and 42-meter water depth, there was an increase in the performance of how well it mimicked the intertidal. I mean, I suppose that's not to be too surprising, but it's really important that just those little distances make a big difference. So can we use offshore data as a proxy for the water conditions that intertidal species experience? Well, there you see the percentages. And so that's either your glass is half full or empty, but it was critically important to share with our tribal partners that that's the capability of the model, right? Some people say like, well, don't you worry about, you know, this, and it's like, Well, yeah, but as long as everybody goes in with their eyes open, that's an important part of co-production, is making sure people understand your assumptions and how well our tools might perform. All right, so here's some results. The plot on the top, the little one, is the present condition for omega aragonite at the bottom. Underneath that is the future, and then you have the delta plot. And so the color is the marine aragonite saturation state. The color in all of those symbols is the percent of the year undersaturated. And so for the delta plot, that's the change in that percent. The darker the symbol, the more the change. And we found that, you know, given the uncertainties of the model, there's some distinct patterns here. And so you can see darker colors along that nearshore strip, as well as off of the shelf break, just inward of that. So that's the annual, but you know what? The annual really doesn't help us. Look at this. This is the 12 months, right? Look at how much variability there is month by month. Okay, so take-home message science-wise is that it's extending the season of undersaturation. So the more dark colors are in the non-summer months when it's already bad. So the bad is just getting more of the year. All right. So imagine this. We have these plots, you know, month by month. Then we did different variables. Then we did different thresholds for different species. We wound up with 300 plots. Oh, how useful is that? Here, boom, there's your 300 plots. So what the social scientists had allowed us to do is to understand what's important to the tribes, okay? Razor clams are one of their vital foods. In fact, there's even a word in the Quileute language for razor clam hungry. And they use razor clam harvests for school supplies. So there's actually a school harvest for razor clams. Very important. Biologically, razor clams can settle, you know, kind of any time of the year, but the bulk of it is in April and May. So now instead of looking at 300 plots, we're going to look at this plot and see where the change is greatest in May. And then also look at this plot where those razor clam beaches are, which are highlighted by those red diamonds. And you actually see a north-south gradient in the percent of the month, in this case, that it's undersaturated, and it's getting worse to the south. Now that's actionable information. That's useful information. So that's what I say about the experience of this, is it really has been fantastic. So species stories I won't go into, but I'm a fan of a place-based approach that could be exported in other areas. Okay, now this is a big shift. Now we're going to talk about another situation of where the nearshore qualities, characteristic data were different. And it's in the context of the blob that's followed by the El Nino. And here is some data from John Mickett showing the change in 2014 from upwelling to downwelling winds. He had the Cheva buoy out there outfitted with temperature every couple of meters. These are not anomalies. This is actual temperature. Look at that change as the winds shifted and the warmer waters came on shore because we had downwelling winds. And look at how distinct that was. Okay, so that's at Cheba. We're learning a lot about that. We're learning how the atmospheric drivers for this happen. But imagine if you're a fish there, you know, how quickly that changed for you. This now looks at two NOAA buoys, one called Washington that's 500 kilometers offshore and almost 3,000 meters of water, and the other that's 32 kilometers offshore in 131 meters of water. And you can see the anomaly, well, the data record for the year is in red and the other years are in the green and blue. But just focusing on the red, you can see for those years how different onshore, offshore is. That's not a surprise. What was a surprise was when Julianne Kohlinger, who worked for the Ho tribe for her master's project, looked at the anomalies in temperature in those sanctuary moorings. So now we're going to look at those, the black dots along the coast. And you can see where the Cape Elizabeth NOAA buoy and where Cheba is. And so again, she focused on the 42 meter one, but here's what she found. Compared to the long-term climatology, which is the solid line, she found in both 2014 and 2015 these positive temperature anomalies that were in these humps, and they came and went on the scale of like 10 to 20 days. But the thing is, these temperature anomalies were up to 4.5 degrees Celsius. This is twice the seasonal average, the seasonal temperature range. Okay, so this is a phenomenon that is happening in response to downwelling favorable winds. But this very nearshore dynamic was very different than what we saw at Cape Elizabeth, or for sure off the Washington Buoy, or even at Cheba. So, so understanding this and thinking about how that's going to affect those organisms that are, you know, here and even farther inshore, thinking about how that affects tribal harvesting and capacities. So with that, what I want to do is, actually, I'm going to go back before I let you look at those. I want to iterate what Melissa said to me, is that in response to the study, the Macaw launched its food sovereignty program, which includes an emphasis on a seed bank and provisioning for the elders. Quinault, Tahola High School, and Quileute Tribal School science programs are now focusing on ocean acidification, and the Hoh tribe is weaving cultural values into local science camp. So this co-design and co-production really can make a difference to all of the partners, and I think that's what's so exciting about this. All right, so now here's my parting shot. What are the implications for ocean observing systems vis-a-vis coastal climate change? These are Jan thinks, but I hope that you agree. We need to increase nearshore observations and develop or maintain observations along offshore onshore gradients in order to better understand how coastal dynamics are different or linked. We need to encourage and promote nearshore modeling beyond typical coastal resolution to better capture nearshore dynamics, which are different in some areas and maybe not in other areas. We need to better constrain where things are similar or whether they're not. The outer coast of Washington is a very dynamic place. I don't know if Tampa Bay is like that, right? You know, so understanding where there's strong differences, where we need that increased attention or not, I think is really incumbent upon us all to optimize our ocean observing system. We need to bridge those doing ocean observing and coastal nearshore modeling to promote the increase of forecasting skill. Modelers and observationalists working together is really important. And I think we need to promote working across social and natural sciences to reveal information useful to science in light of climate change. So thank you.
All righty, we've got about 15 minutes here available for questions. I'd like to invite anybody to ask questions of any of our three speakers. And I think people could just sort of queue up at the microphones. No need to raise hands since we have to get up there anyways.
Yeah, Director OAP, Jen, thanks for presenting on this. You know, our program's real excited about this intersection between social vulnerability and acidification. But as I'm looking at the data and what's coming in, I'm seeing there are major gaps that we have in terms of what we can model and describe based on what they're looking for. We're not talking coastal conditions. You're talking about at the beach, right? Those razor clams are existing and exposed to sediment pore fluids. So the idea that JScope is going to be able to describe that chemical environment seems like an real leap of faith. So it looks like at best we're probably not even as good as a coin flip in being able to describe the environment with the modeling we have right now. So I'm curious, how do we optimize the observing system to provide them information on that? And at that level of detail, I mean, we're not talking about AUVs, we're talking about lysimeters being stuck into the sediment. I mean, are there life cycles of that organism that we can speak to? Because we're not going to be able to speak with an ocean observing system or even a coastal observing system to the chemical conditions that are described that describe the habitat in which those organisms that are important culturally to them reside. Am I misinterpreting this? Am I wrong here?
No, you're not wrong, but I have more hope that we can crack the nut. I think that, yes, we need more observations in that area. The observations that the Olympic National Park had, the intertidal sensors, and I might add that we only used it when the sensor was wet. So they had temperature at the time. Now, thanks to the Washington OA Center, they're putting in pH and salinity. So we're increasing the capability to get some of that data. These results that I presented are several years old. We, I think, have the capacity to, you know, as I said, in whichever bullet it was, maybe the third, to really keep working with the modelers to see how well that performance can be enhanced. Yeah, I think that that's really incumbent upon us to keep pushing on, but I think that it's something that's doable. Of course, it's going to take funding, but it's an important area to push on, I think. And, you know, some of the organisms were halibut, so that's in an area where our data are better. But I think that some of the, while there are differences, when you looked at some of those delta plots, I feel like the response was so consistent about where some of these major things like extending the season or having a stronger emphasis inshore, and it was based on a gradient of points offshore to inshore. I think that those things probably do ring true, but I think that we can take steps to really improve status quo. Thank you.
Chen from Wuhao Oceanographic Institution. My question is for Jacob. So very nice talk, showing that schematic, explaining the connection of open ocean sea level to the coast. If we were to think about ocean dynamics, the changes of the pressure gradient field will involve geostrophic adjustment. In your case, that will produce velocity or transport along isobath. In other words, the sea level signal doesn't go directly across isobath, at least not locally. So to reach that, I guess, equilibrium state you're describing, adjustment need to happen over a certain spatial and temporal scale. So can you comment on that adjustment process? And because we are here to talk about optimizing observations, what type of observations do we need to capture this adjustment process? Or in other words, the connection of the open ocean sea level all the way to the coast?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't talk at all about the dynamical adjustment that's associated with this, that the state that I've been considering and thinking about is this, I've referred to it as like a static equilibrium component of the response, on top of which there's a dynamical response that I haven't directly looked at. But the fact that I would see pretty decent skill in these predictions or these assessments would lead me to believe that the two components of the response are not, one doesn't dwarf the other kind of thing. Like, I think they're both relevant. And that speaks to some time scale, like you said, of adjustment. I think the process that I'm thinking about and assessing is a rapid, more barotropic-like response, and that a dynamical adjustment would happen on top of this over some longer time period. But I don't think there's a lot of theory that has explored this, and I'd be happy to talk more about that with you. In terms of observing changes along the shelf and slope, I would, I think capturing that cross-shelf horizontal density gradient and the vertical as you get to deeper waters would be really important. I know we do that in some cases, like the Pioneer Array, right? It sits on the slope, or it did. But yeah, what comes to mind, and one of the, like what I talked about of bottom density, I think has some promise in being a a variable that we can think more about or use. Thanks.
Thank you all for your presentations. Michelle, I just had a question for you about PACE. I'm extremely excited about it, and I was just wondering if you could speak to the release of the data and the strengths and weaknesses of what we can expect to come.
Yeah, so PACE in itself is sort of the next generation ocean color sensor. So previous was multispectral, now we're into a new paradigm of imaging spectroscopy, which, big data, welcome. So with respect to that, right now, some of the products that are available are the typical standard, just applied to their existing algorithms, but tweaked for obviously the more bands that they have. I know right now they're still extensively validating the phytoplankton community composition product, which is brand new. So they have an airborne campaign that's actually happening right now off the west coast of California called PACE Packs. And I think we can expect that after such an extensive sort of airborne and in-water campaign that we should see the release of the products. The exact date, I don't know. But I could easily find out from Jeremy Wardell, the PACE project scientist. But anyways, overall, I think like SWAT, which is sort of the next generation ocean altimeter that allows not only higher resolution, open ocean sea surface height, but also more accurately resolves at the coastal interface. It also allows hydrology observations to be made, which is sort of unparalleled. And PACE, I think, is the equivalent for the ocean biology. So I think what we're going to see from both these sensors, and perhaps again, the coupling of the two of them together is going to be groundbreaking. So let's stay tuned. Definitely check out the data, but I'll find out specifics and I can write you or anybody else that's interested on when that'll be coming out.
Thanks, Ed Dever here again. Following up on, I think, Kay Chen's question and your response, Jacob, I was thinking about the role of seafloor cables and distributed acoustic sensing as DAS to that. On some level, if they're buried, I guess they're really measuring the sediment temperature, which might be interesting, but at places where they're exposed, is that one possibility of getting some high resolution, I mean, not perfect density, but at least temperature-based density to look at sea level changes?
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I don't know enough about those networks, but I think, yeah, it's a good suggestion to think more about.
Hi, my name is Treasure Warren. I'm from the University of Washington, a PhD student. My question's for Jan. I was really inspired by the image of the coastal ecosystem you showed. I think it's funny how we often forget that humans are a part of our coastal ecosystems, or at least we don't represent them in our work. And it's my understanding that a lot of indigenous tribes have struggles working with federal and university researchers because of institutional timelines and funding and things like that. And I'm curious about your experience with the co-designing process and how that maybe shaped or reshaped some of the questions you've been asking, or the process in general of the approach to your work.
Thank you so much, Treasure, for that question. And it's a really important one. Time. It takes time. And when we wrote the proposal, we were really making sure that we had the 4 treaty tribes involved. One of them couldn't get it past their council in time. So we could allude to the potential of that tribe joining, but we couldn't submit the proposal that way. They subsequently did join, and now who cares what the proposal said? We were able to amend it and show them as an equal partner. So there's things like that. We've definitely sent the message, I think, and a lot of this has happened through the IOOC network, and shout out to people like Shayna Wisdom up in Alaska, Melissa Iwamoto in the Pacific Islands, that we need to change some things, like, for instance, the ability in your budget to have gifts or provide food, and that this is a cultural practice. And if we're going to say that the government is going to be doing this, we need to be sure that we're following through on the way that it works. Time. It's no surprise, and I'm sure to Dwight, that this project had 2 no-cost extensions. We would have taken a third had we been able to. It just took longer. And then, of course, COVID happened in the middle of it. And that was a real frustration because we couldn't have the kind of gatherings there with the tribal members. In fact, Melissa and I were out at the Ho tribe. They had a community dinner and they asked us to speak. And so this is in 2024 now, right? And so this research is a little long in the tooth, but this was the first time we were able to speak with the tribal members at their community dinner to go over this stuff. So it takes time, and I think we really need to send the message to the federal government agencies about how important these things are. I think NOAA has definitely changed, and we had a great fiscal administrator in the IOOC program office, Deborah Esty, and she's like, here's how you do this. Here's how you do the federal speak in order to do what you want to do. So those translators who can help us with it. But it's not trivial, and I think that's why a lot of scientists maybe, I don't want to start that. That sounds complicated, but I can just say it's incredibly rewarding. And I think as we build community and this becomes more commonplace, that's what we need to do. Thank you, Treasure. All right, look at how well behaved you all are. Thank you for coming back on time. I know it's beautiful outside, but I am so excited for this next panel because we're really putting people in the picture. There we go. Awesome. All right, so welcome to the Observing for Society panel discussion. We have 5 distinguished guests with us here, one who is online, and we are going to be discussing several aspects of engaging with society and societal needs for information for the ocean observing system. With me, I have Glenn Gierach from Woods Hole. On the far end, Deborah Hernandez from the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, SOCORA, Emily Lamaggi from NOAA PMEL, Connor McGee, and Margaret Pallaro from Connor is from University of California, Davis, and Margaret Pallaro from the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. So at this point, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they do and sort of what motivates them to be here. So I'm just going to go in order, and Glenn, then Margaret, then Emily, then Deborah, and then Connor. Glenn?
Oh, okay. I'm Glenn Gierach. I'm a physical oceanographer. I've been at the Woods Hole Oceanographic for 35 years there. And my research is centered around shelf break processes. And I worked very closely with the OOI Pioneer Array there. And that led to a very, very surprising turn in my activities because of the engagement of the commercial fishing community. They were initially very opposed to the Pioneer Array. And working through a lot of different things, I have a lot of anecdotes about that. But now I'm in constant communication with the commercial fishing industry, and we're trying to figure out recent changes there. And I'm frequently texting owners of fishing companies and things on advice. And then finally, I am a member of an informal group called the Squid Squad that meets every Friday morning at 10 a.m. And that's run out of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. But we have representatives from anywhere from 4 to 6 commercial fishing companies. And so I get the absolute latest up-to-date commercial fishing information every week.
Good morning. My name is Margaret Pallaro, and I'm Executive Director at the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. The association was founded in a slightly different form back in 1930, so it's been around for a while. And we've seen a variety of changes in the way we are growing mussels, clams, oysters, and a large burrowing clam called the gooey duck. And some of those changes have resulted from market shifts, from a shucked market to a half shell market, which many of you may be enjoying at your local oyster bars. Shifts from a natural set to almost complete reliance upon hatcheries. And changes in methods for growing these shellfish and where we grow the shellfish. the shellfish is only growing where it's happiest. So we don't put any food or fertilizer in the water. So it's really important. One of the critical things to know about our association is that it's made up of mostly multi-generational farmers. So folks who are taking care of property and a business that their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents have started. So there's a lot of history, a lot of pride in this association and in the group of both tribal and non-tribal businesses. I started the job back in 2010, and 6 weeks into the post, I attended our growers meeting, and I don't mean to call anyone out, but Dick Feely was our keynote speaker at that meeting. And I was new and I was like so excited to be there, la la la. And out of the keynote session, people were sort of teaming out of it with really long drawn faces. And it kind of freaked me out. And I was like, oh my God, like what is happening in there? What could be going on? And I asked somebody and they said, well, this very accomplished oceanographer has just identified that some of these mass mortality events that we've been experiencing at 90% loss is a result of this old water coming up from the ocean and upwelling, and there's basically nothing we can do. So I was pretty freaked out, and I thought, yikes, what are we going to do? And we had been engaging Congress and others in trying to figure out what was happening when we were experiencing these mortalities. But I worked with my group at the association and Jan and other IOOCians that I refer to you all by, and looked at how do we learn more about this? What can we do? And there was a blue ribbon panel for ocean acidification that was set up. We worked very closely with Congress to make sure that we had the resources that we could to understand what this issue was and eventually come up with some sort of workaround. So I'm glad to be here to talk a little bit more about what that all means.
I'm Emily Lamachi. I'm with the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab with NOAA, so representing maybe federal agency on this panel. I'm in the EcoFoci program, which is NOAA's longest running cross-line office program. So I'm a physical oceanographer at PMEL in the research leg of NOAA. And we are regionally focused in Alaska marine waters. And the other half of our program sits at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in working on research and management information needs as well. And so the goal of our program is understanding oceanic and climate variability in Alaska marine waters in order to support effective management of Alaska's living marine resources. And for a little bit more background on the perspective that I bring to that group, I have a degree in undergrad degree in physics and English. My master's research was in marine resource management. I took coastal law classes and environmental economics. I worked for a period at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife at the time when the marine reserves process was just getting initiated. I was at OSU for 10 years while OOI was spinning up. And I integrate all of these perspectives, and also I grew up in a coastal region fishing and clamming. And so these perspectives really come into how I see my role as a physical oceanographer, how I inform my science, and how I communicate. And so I think it's really an honor to be a part of this panel and be able to discuss kind of successes and challenges in that realm with the science community.
Hi, folks. Deborah Hernandez. I'm the executive director for Socorro, which I think most of you know is one of the 11 IOOC's regional associations. I'm an engineer by training, a native of Charleston, South Carolina, and I've worked in the South my entire career. A little more about Socorro. We cover the footprint that includes all of the state of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. And generally, we limit our work to the first 2 counties inland from the coast. A little more context is that Socorro is a very small nonprofit. Over the last year, we've gone from 4 people to 7. And our geography is 4 states, as I mentioned. And I have colleagues around the country who are similarly challenged to express our work across a pretty sizable geography. So the majority of that work is accomplished through our PIs and other partners. 80 to 90% of our funding goes out to those folks. And the vast majority of that funding is to collect observations and deliver those back for various users. And I'll close my opening with a few comments about why I think I'm on this panel. We launched a community observing program about 3 years ago. We're working with 2 fairly low-cost sensors, water levels and cameras, and all of those approximately 120 sensors are deployed in communities. The only reason that was possible was because of often long-standing relationships that our PIs and other partners, including Sea Grant extension agents in the states, had already with these communities. And I also would add that most importantly, this community observing program is about enabling communities to collect, own, understand the data that they need to make the decisions that affect their quality of life and the resilience of their community. As has been mentioned just a few times over the last couple of days, sea level rise and climate change is having significant impacts in our region, and communities are frustrated by the challenges they're facing. And one thing that this program is doing is giving them some tools so they feel like they can do something and make better decisions themselves.
Thank you, Deborah. Connor, I'm coming to you, but I want to say something real quick about the IUS network that Deborah just mentioned. There are 11 regional associations. We have 5 directors here. I realize it's Deborah and the 4 J's. We have Julio from Caracas in the Caribbean, Jorge from the Gulf, Jake from the Northeast, and Jan from the Northwest. So anyway, it's a good singing group maybe. But I think one of the things that, even though we're small but mighty, is that what Deborah has developed in the Southeast is nearing out to the rest of the regions through this IRA opportunity. And so it's so lovely to see some of the things that have developed in one RA get spread out. So I just want to thank you for your leadership on that. Okay, Connor, coming to you. Oops, we can't hear you. Try that again.
We still cannot hear you, Connor. You might want to, you can jump into the virtual green room and we'll test with you and bring you back into the main session.
Okay, good. Now, did that change? Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Oh, great.
Yes,
great.
That's great, Connor. Thank you.
I always need to set time aside for that. Hello, my name is Connor McGee. I'm a member of the Paulo Band of Mission Indians, Puyum Puchum in Korea. I'm a 4th year doctoral student at UC Davis and affiliated with the Coastal Marine Sciences Institute there in the Sustainable Oceans Program. It's an NSF research traineeship. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for including me. It's really humbling. This is a new space for me, working in ocean systems. I come from a terrestrial ecological background, and that's what my graduate work is in terrestrial ecology and marine and ocean ecology now. And it's just really humbling to be on this panel. I'm really excited. I know that I'm just going to learn a lot from our panelists and the questions that get brought to the table. So a lot of my research that I've been focusing on at UC Davis in the marine and coastal realm is working with our tribal communities and tribal-led initiatives for community resilience and adaptation planning. A lot of this work I've been doing for over a decade in the terrestrial realm, and over the past 5-6 years, been working with our tribal communities in Southern California to vision a resilient future for our communities in the coastal marine spaces. There's been numerous workshops that we've held throughout the years, one-on-one interviews, and as this ongoing research, there's really two large thematic areas that are surfacing. One of them being is as our tribal communities, and I know that you probably recognize this within your institutions and within some larger federal initiatives calling for working with tribal communities in their RFPs, and tribes are approached quite frequently to be a part of a lot of these different initiatives. And one of the sort of hurdles that has come up, and then we've heard it from both sides of the table, is meaningful engagement. To have the sort of, and this is on both sides of the table, for the competency to be able to partner together. And for tribal communities, it gets a bit complicated. There are unique relationships with the state and federal government, very special relationship with the federal government, jurisdictional boundaries that sometimes have left us out of participating in a lot of initiatives throughout the coastal region in Southern California. But those things are changing. And so one of the things that tribes have voiced to us, that as we're working with our counterparts, whether it be NOAA or Sea Grant, et cetera, that those researchers have the understanding of these unique relationships we have with the government, and also what the role the coast plays in our communities as these epic civic centers that are so important to us. The pedagogies and the way that we teach our children and we learn from our elders around our responsibilities with our coastal regions. And so successfully, we've been able to, through the Climate Science Alliance and Script Sea Grant, have been able to host an initial training where we all came to the table, and there was Indigenous instructors that came to Sea Grant and shared a lot of these, sort of unique things that tribes have to face when partnering with large institutions, federal agencies, state agencies. And another large thematic area is how we as people that have been forcibly removed from the coast. I come from a coastal tribe. All of our stories, all of our language links us with the coast, with our islands. And we've been forcibly removed for nearly 100 years. And that's changing now. That's changing where we're able to participate. We have a seat at the table. We're making decisions on our coastal areas. And so a lot of what I hope to be able to share today really circles around that. And I'll go ahead and leave it there so we have enough time before a panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connor. Okay, if I could get the next slide. Cool. Okay, so in queuing up this discussion, which we're really excited to share with you all, these were the questions that the Scientific Oversight Committee or Organizing Committee put together. We've sent these out to the panelists. I'm going to be asking each one of them the second question. We're going to go through that. But before we start that, I wanted to offer, because some questions really pertain to specific perspectives that one or more of you have, and then others like, oh, I got something to say about several questions. So I'd like to invite our panelists to take this time to share what you would like to address in this next discourse. And then we're going to go through, and I'm going to ask you specifically about number 2, which still says it's number 1. It's okay. We know how to count. And then we are also going to, after we have some good panel discussion, and I'm sure some of it will be, hey, what that person said, and I want to expound on that. So we'll exhaust that. And then we're going to come to the audience, both online and in the room, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So there will be time for you to participate. So I'm just going to open the floor. Let's just go in the same order. Glenn, how would you like to respond?
I would like to respond on the 5th number 1 question there, which is, what is the role of commercial for-profit entities in observing coastal climate? What are the benefits and or drawbacks? And I've been involved since 2014 with something called the Shelf Research Fleet. And we've been giving CTDs to Rhode Island fishing vessels. And it has just been truly remarkable. Because it enables the kind of close interactions where we learn about the
the specifics of commercial fishing, including learning about market forces, learning about how they perceive climate change, and we get the opportunity to educate them about ocean processes. And one of the things I'm probably most proud of over the last 10 years is a lot of fishermen along the east coast of the United States know what a mid-depth salinity maximum intrusion is. And when we finished our NSF project, we had a brochure explaining this that went out to 300 Rhode Island fishermen, fishers. And it's been remarkable because what we've been able to do is teach them about the processes so that in real time, they are looking at their profiles and making decisions on where and when to fish based on the ocean processes they're interpreting. And one of the best examples of this is actually bottom intrusions, because warm salty water can come from the upper continental slope and go as much as 100 kilometers onshore. And it turns out that monkfish fishing, which is primarily a gillnet fishery, the monkfish just completely turn off. So they know it's time to go into port, get the boat fixed, not pay people. And so I think this level of deep interaction is really important. This is where the research is having direct economic and social impact. And it's really sustained engagement. It's taken 10 years to get to this point. And I can't say enough about all the people that have worked on OOI, because in addition to the actual profiles, I was showing OOI data all the time, and also my favorite NDBC buoy, 44008 there. But it has really deepened my appreciation of how important it is to follow what the ocean is doing in as close to real time as possible. And so I get texts, I get emails all the time. I might get a photograph of an unusual bycatch. What the heck is this? And also extreme events there. And there was a bottom intrusion in 2017. I was emailed a photo of a Gulf Stream flounder that was caught off of Block Island in January 2017. And it turns out there was a 5°C warm anomaly that January. To close here, I've been in hair on fire mode this year because the commercial fishing industry in the Northeast is facing an incredible oceanographic drawback, which is a 3 to 5°C cold anomaly this year. And so the warmer species, the tropicalization of the Northeast shelf actually kind of reversed this year. And we were hearing back in February and March, initially from New Jersey fishermen, different species were showing up 4 to 5 weeks late. And we were able to turn it in to the, to this incredible cold bottom waters, 5°C colder this June than last June there. So at the Pioneer 2 workshop, I actually asked Janet and I a question, and on the spur of the moment came up with the word detropicalization for this particular year. But having this close engagement and following things every week has just been a real game changer for me.
I won't do the interpretive dance for you all today, but I think in response to that piece about the role of commercial in observing, I think this is a really interesting one. We are seeing a lot of technical development and improvements sort of come through, and that's really exciting. And I think a lot of that is coming from angel investors that will provide us with some great steps forward. But I would use some caution in making sure that that technology maintains connections to the policy and the regulatory environment and stakeholders, so that whatever is developed is actually something that will sustain and work and be used. I think that we're not to throw into anything right now, but we're in this really awkward spot where we're seeing wind development on the West Coast. And I know there's some of you who've kind of worked on that on the East Coast, but this is a really big problem for the nearshore stakeholders and the uses that are there. And I think we've spent a lot of attention looking at what happens offshore and where that all goes. But there will be impacts. Absolutely, 100% to uses in the near shore. We have a shellfish community up in Humboldt Bay that is absolutely in the crosshairs of wind development. And we were late to the party. No one thought about what the impacts would be. And when we look towards what can we ask for mitigation or for data, for information, I think we should lean a little bit hard on these wind companies to help us integrate our data better and achieve information that we would only dream about having. And it's going to take a concerted effort, but I think that this is something that as professionals in the environment, with your scientific knowledge, with stakeholders, with agencies that are scratching their head trying to figure out how do we meet our wind objectives or our renewable energy objectives, but not impact some of these other uses, this might be a way forward. So that's my little pitch on that piece. I think my favorite question really is the first number one, and I think that the first number one bleeds into all of them, right? And for me, that really relates to the relationships that we have from those who are creating the data and analyzing the data, and from those who need the data. And that relationship needs to be pretty fluid, but solid. And there are times when you all come to my people and say, hey, this is what we're seeing. We may not understand it. So we need to have a relationship that is strong enough so that we can say, we don't know what you're talking about. This isn't working for us. And be able to share that. And so when Jan and her folks stepped forward back in 2011 timeframe, we established that relationship, and we so that growers could feel like there wasn't anything but benefit from working with Jan and bringing them onto the farm and having that kind of work being done. Things change all the time on the farm, and you all know that. But what you may not remember or think about is that staff changes. The growing method changes, the market changes, the policies and the regulatory framework that we're operating in change. And so by having a solid relationship, that all information is seamless. We can share that with you and feel comfortable and safe sharing that with you and continue to move forward. So the other piece that I forgot to mention about the growers is that most of our farms are small, less than 10 employees. And so all of those folks have a vested interest in what you all can share in terms of the technical information and the science that they need to do their work. And so if you've ever, or if you remember teaching your grandparents how to program the VCR, or if you've taught somebody who's older than you, post a video on a text thread, you know that there needs to be some time to build that knowledge and that awareness. And so that's really how I feel like integrating your work with the communities is very important, by building that relationship and understanding where folks are coming from on that end.
I kind of agree that the first question resonated with me, but I think all of them, and it's kind of an integral theme of the discussion, and I'm hearing kind of integral themes already. The co-development of ideas as part of integrating needs is a key piece, and I feel so fortunate that I've come into a program, or maybe 20 years ago, that those were fringe ideas, but NOAA has really embraced that and begun to prioritize that, and leaders at PMEL, Simone Allen and Adrian Sutton and Phyllis Stabenow have established a lot of relationships and co-developed ideas to the point where some of those are long-term and integrated into our observing systems and our products already. And building off of that, for some examples, the Pacific Northwest Harmful Algal Bloom Bulletin is an equal partnership between federal, state, local, and tribal communities. And in Alaska, it used to be too cold for HABs to be a major risk. And now that's become a priority, co-develop rapid assessment methods across communities and have that monitoring infrastructure in place. And some success stories, I think, from having that in place. We collaboratively work with commercial fisher people, and ship time is one of the largest expenses for our observing system, the largest recurring expenses. I give it to you, Michelle, that satellites are probably pretty expensive. And having instrumentation on the fishing fleet and partnering with them to deploy some of our pop-ups and drifters is a huge asset for our spatial and temporal extending our monitoring, but also during COVID shutdowns, we relied on them heavily to be able to deploy stuff and maintain some of our time series when there were other challenges that prevented our normal way of doing things. And that what has been fundamental for building those co-developed programs is the communication, the two-way or multi-directional communication and ongoing communication. And an example of that resonated in looking at the questions was limiting impacts of vessel impacts. And we go to the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission meetings to go over all of our cruises and research plans, and we report out our plans ahead of time. We report out results and summaries afterwards. And in our Arctic cruise, NOAA puts out daily reports to the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission on our activities and outcomes. And that is integrated, those communications. We also manage the email list for the Alaska communities. And so that's not just a one-way communication, but that's a way also where it provides an opportunity for feedback and two-way conversations and meetings, and regularly going to, you can't cover all of the communities, but meeting with representatives in Alaska. And so that has allowed us, I think, as a pivotal kind of BHAG for all of this that has been touted at this meeting too, is the CEFI, the operational modeling and decision support system, that we're able to integrate all of that knowledge and the ways of knowing and the different ways that we're gathering information as a program that is integral in the information that we put out. And then it also in the continued observations that are used to validate and develop that model and to validate and develop our observing system.
Thank you, Emily. Deborah.
Thanks, Jan. So first I want to clarify one thing. I described earlier, I hope most people realized our terrestrial boundary. We are actually doing work in the water on the ocean side of the shoreline. So just want to make sure everybody knew that. To the first number one, I think there are options for how you integrate vulnerable community needs into development of observing systems. You can't be everywhere all the time. And I do think the foundational sort of truth that you've already heard is it takes time and it takes relationship building. And it's very challenging to have short-term project funds directed to places where you've never been before. And that's a recipe for disaster in terms of co-developing systems. So I'm just amplifying, I think, what everyone has already said there. In terms of the second number one, needs via climate information, the ones that I hear most often for our region are around improved high resolution forecasting of various hazards for the people who live and work on the coast, whether it's sargassum inundation, whether it's flooding events due to extreme precipitation, whether it's heat actually more and more in marine waters and on the coastal land side. Those are critically needed. And what we're doing now is good, but it's just not good enough given the amplification of some of these threats. And then the final point I'll make is that reanalysis products of for decadal 30-year records of how the ocean is changing are pivotal to supporting fisheries management and fishers understanding of threats and opportunities to changes in the ocean environment.
Thank you. Okay, Connor, over to you.
So yes, thank you for bringing in the importance of relationships. Right, it's something that drives all of our work inside and outside of the Ivory Tower and other institutions in the community. You know, sort of a bold step that I've always seen be successful is when submitting RFPs, proposals, and you know, building a nonprofit, whatever it may be. The communities that you're working with need a seat on that board. They need a seat within that proposal, and not as a sub-awardee, right? Is sort of a PI. The way that the sort of the infrastructure is set up now is that within the institution, there's the PI that gets to make all the decisions and control all of the resources and really guide the questions. But for true integration into developing ocean observing systems, it really takes community buy-in, right? And what brings buy-in if you don't have decision-making power and control of the resources for your community, right? An equal valuation of knowledge is something that I've seen really cause is a stumbling block. Not understanding other knowledge systems, and that relationship building really unlocks the key to having that equal valuation of knowledge and respect on both sides of the table. And I would really advocate for that in sort of developing any sort of observing system, and that goes beyond just an ocean observing system, right? Or creating a model, working with an Indian community. If they don't feel value in being there, and they don't feel value in putting their community's data in their division of their community, it's really hard to have that true integration.
Thank you, Connor. Okay, I want to open the floor to the panelists to comment on anything that you heard another panelist say. And then I'm going to come to you about your climate information needs and pick a little bit deeper on that. I've got some additional questions there. But before I do that, I just want to see, we're not in a conversation here. We're on this, linear panel. And so does anybody want to say something about something you heard another one of your panelists say? Okay, so moving on. So what I want to now go through and ask each of you. So the question says, the second question is about climate information needs, and Deborah did some of her homework already, but I want to hear from everybody about what climate information needs you have. But not only that, what do you know of, or what you directly experience, limit the decision-making that you're involved in? And then lastly, do you see any opportunity where ocean observing data or products could help with the current situation? So it's a bit of a big lift, but take any of that and run with it. Glenn, over to you.
Okay, well, it was really interesting to see how the fishing community responded when the OOI Pioneer Array moved out of the region. And in fact, despite all the initial hostility, Fred Matera, the president of the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, was at the site choosing workshop to actually advocate for staying in New England, because that subsurface information was really, really important. And we're seeing huge interannual jumps in temperature right now. And so in terms of the fisheries management needs, that's really critical. So 3 weeks ago, I went to Chatham to meet with people from the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance. And their executive director, John Papalardo, was the head of the New England Fisheries Management Council for 10 years. And so I was showing him this incredible cold, fresh pulse that came in 2023, 2024. And he said the fisheries management system is broken this year. And he said, in the council deliberations, there is no oceanography. We're talking strictly about population dynamics, and everything is based on mortality relative to the previous year there. And so, improving our networks, particularly for subsurface observations. And so in the Squid Squad calls, I'm asked really difficult questions every week. And I'm having to go a lot off of SST right now. There. And so, having that subsurface information is just really important there.
I think we don't necessarily know exactly what we need. We are faced with mortality. We're faced with the presence of harmful algal blooms coming more frequently and for longer. We're struggling on the testing side on that piece. I think that the fact that our nation is still using mice bioassay is problematic, but that's a different set of questions for a different group. But I think that the importance is we would like to be able to forecast. We'd like to learn what we've observed and see what's in the future. We need some boots on the ground so you all can understand what that information is meaning to us and how we can use it, and we can learn from you in terms of how else we might be able to use it. We're in this kind of unfortunate time where we don't get to ask if, it's when. And so I think that anything you all can gather and analyze, that's an important part, not just gathering and letting it sit, but figuring out what it all means, and then help us with okay, so now what? What do we do with that? We are fairly well organized in terms of bringing issues to decision makers at the federal level. But we have to be able to understand and have the relationship with all of you to carry those messages forward. So anything that you can give us, as long as you give us some context that we can then do something with, would be great.
Thank you, Margaret. Over to you, Emily.
I'll just start in the context of this question about being clear on the perspective that I'm representing. NOAA research provides critical and foundational information in support of decision making, but I am not a decision maker in that capacity myself. But that said, our needs are really to understand the system and prioritize and address the challenges that society's facing, and we're aware of those. Right now, the state of our knowledge is the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the global mean. The warming oceans, the loss of sea ice, sea level rise, acidification, they're all impacting the ecosystem structure, distribution. These problems that we're facing, I think there's a communal awareness in the Alaska breakout session that we had yesterday. I think we reached consensus, I think, pretty well on the science priorities, and that within that consensus was that the needs associated with that vary spatially. So there's some big picture needs, and then there's also a lot of detail that we could not cover in that section that we also acknowledged. But within that, there's a lot of opportunity. So we manage NOAA's long-term moorings in the Arctic. and have regular cruises with repeat sampling and to service those moorings. And so one example of that opportunity is using that platform for partnerships. We partner with Natalie Menacci at the Ocean Acidification Research Center to collect PCO2 measurements on the mooring platform. And also for getting feedback, there's a lot of opportunities for adapting to the changing climate information needs based on the conditions that we face. I produce several sections for NOAA's ecosystem status reports for Alaska, including a state of the climate, climate overview, and forecast sections, which are very broad. But the information that we have from monitoring, I get really hard questions, but it's encouraging with digging or reaching out to partners to gather information that we don't have in-house. How many of those questions we're able to tackle. From our long-term temperature modeling, we were able to predict warming temperature changes and ecosystem impacts, such as those for snow crab. But there have also been interesting lessons from that. One thing was that the analysis of the snow crab conditions had found that it was warming temperatures, but also associated with competition. And so it's these multi-parameter impacts that we're focusing on. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity as we have these communication systems and feedbacks to be aware and adaptable so that we can continue to be relevant and provide the information that's most needed.
Thank you, Emily. Deborah.
Thanks, Jan. Let me begin by endorsing Glenn's call out for subsurface temperature and other data. I think that's just a huge gap and hugely important for understanding the system and particularly the things that people care about in the system. Since I already didn't follow instructions and talked a bit already about our needs, I'm going to go back to your point about how decision making can be limited. And as I've said, I live and work in the South, and in the near recent past, talking about sea level rise and climate change was pretty challenging. That has changed, but lack of trust in scientists and in data and in global projections of change is a real thing still. And one of the things that our low-cost sensors, particularly the water level, is enabling is communities and people, decision makers in communities, a bit of a reality check in that they can see data from an instrument they can go and walk to and see and touch, and they can have conversations about the fact that this high water event that's happening every 4 years is likely to shift, happening 4 times a year to potentially 40 times a year, and the impacts they're seeing on their infrastructure and their community and their quality of life being amplified. The need to put tools again in the hands of communities so that they can bridge the gap in understanding and trust, I think can make a big difference and is a real opportunity for all of us.
Thank you, Deborah. Connor, over to you.
Yes, the thing that really jumps out in my mind is data visualization tools. I've seen those there's been 2 projects that I was affiliated with San Diego State and University of California, Riverside, where we're working on plant habitat suitability models, as well as under 3 different scenarios that were modeled under emissions for fire regimes, surface water regimes, biodiversity. And we co-developed these data visualization tools over a period of 3 years. It was hard. We continue to have workshops, and this might sound really familiar to everybody in the room, but you really work on a GIS tool that seems like it's accessible to everybody, and you have a workshop, and then if we don't understand the language you're using, I don't understand what these toggles are doing. And then you have to like sort of bang your head against the wall and go back to the whiteboard. After doing that for a few years, watching these data visualization tools come together and being able to toggle over 3 different emission scenarios of where a species might be migrating, where a species might be going extinct, where fire regimes and carbon loads might be shifting. And these workshops were held over all age groups, all backgrounds. We got robust feedback, and they were very difficult tools to build. But at the end, I think that there was a tool for end users to use to make informed decisions. Because I did sit through some painful modeling, sort of decoding modeling workshops as well. And I know that a lot of folks left the room feeling more frustrated at the end than they did even in the beginning. And, a lot of this is really difficult, really unpacking models and, what's being captured in the model is sometimes really hard to convey in a short period of time with people from, a variety of different backgrounds. Over time, I think it could be successful, but creating strong data visualization tools for end users, for decision makers, I think is one of the strongest components that can come out of modeling that I've seen so far. I could put the links of those. I could put the links of those tools in the chat too, so it's just not out there in your imagination.
That would be fantastic. Please do that, and then we can make those available. I think we can perhaps see the chat at some point. But thank you, Connor. I really appreciate that. Can you click the slide one more time? There we go. Okay, so we're at the point. I've got a couple of questions queued up for each individual panelist, but what we want to hear from are you. What are your questions that you have for this esteemed panel that we have, both if you're in the room as well as online? And here you can use Slido. If you want to come to the microphone, do it. If you want to type your question or your comment into the Slido app, we're going to be turning to that in a bit. Nick's going to help me with that. So do that. I'm going to go through real quick while you guys are thinking about things and ask a question of each of you. So Glenn, how did you learn to talk to the people that you do? You're trained as a scientist. How did you cross that bridge?
That is a great question. It was going into 3rd grade classrooms and explaining shelf break eddy fluxes to elementary school children. And I have to say, going into the schools, you really have to, really hone down your message, get very simple. And it took me a few tries, but my secret weapon was the inflatable globe. So the hyperactive children could always just play volleyball in the back. But there's something actually I talk to my students and postdocs about now, which is a skill, which is narrative oceanography. And random group number 1, I tip my hat to you, better storytelling. How we get the message across to decision makers. We're used to talking to the specialists all the time. And we don't get as much of the training in terms of really reaching out to people. I speak to the public every chance I can get to the fishing community. I particularly enjoy talks at fish processing plants now there. But I'm constantly exposing myself to new audiences there. I have done an interview with Fox News from Boston there. And I think continually stretching myself in terms of communications has been really important there. But, this is something, and I've been talking with students about this for years, is the whole storytelling side of science. And the thing that I always wonder about is humor always draws people in. And so one of the themes that I work into my talks now is actually sea monsters. It turns out people really like sea monsters. And so I can just flip in on a slide something from a map from the 1500s. And that usually wakes people.
That's awesome. We have so much to learn from you. And I really appreciate talking to 3rd graders. There's no better way to start perfecting your storytelling, And, some people, I'm not good at that. But I think we all can be better. So thank you, Glenn. Margaret, You mentioned forecasts and you said that shellfish growers want forecasts. Do you hear about the time scale that they want it? Do they want it on days? Do they want it at the end of the century? Do they want it 10 years from now? What do you hear from the forecast or from the growers about that?
I think that because growing shellfish, there's so many different steps involved in it, and the impacts can be severe depending on if you do the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so I think the time piece would be closer to weeks and months rather than end of century. Because end of century means sort of like you're thinking about, well, where else could I be growing and doing that? And I think people are really concerned about how to handle their immediate crop and their immediate sales orders. There's somewhat of a joke, but it's true that in order to be a shellfish farmer, you have to kill a couple million shellfish. And so they're good at killing shellfish as they go through and try to learn the system. But certainly some of the things that we learned from your work and some of the other monitoring that came out is, there are times where you don't want to do certain things. So putting out small seed when you're in the middle of an upwelling event would be foolish. If you knew that the alignment of the tides and the sun exposure and the hottest part of the day are going to occur, you might harvest or you might plant sooner or you might hold off. If you had an idea that a harmful algal bloom was around the corner, you'll harvest. You'll store that product in order to avoid a recall of product. So I think the piece of that really is in days or weeks.
That's great. Thank you, Margaret. And I'm reflecting back as you were speaking about Dwight's question of me, and if you'll permit me just to take a little moment. I was remembering the J-scope model was looking at hypoxia, and the Quinault Indian Nation actually used that to say, we're going to take our pots out sooner than later. So even though we're not still perfecting the razor clam issue, and it's actually with a different model, not J-scope, there's things that are really helping with day to day. Do I leave it in? Do I take it out? And I think that's where we really have to capitalize in finding out where those information needs are. Cool. Thank you. Emily, you've done such a beautiful job of talking about what NOAA is and does and some of your role in that. But I think you've really described a lot of the work and it's impressive. But I want to know, what would make your work easier?
Yeah, I just heard money, money, money. That's hard to say. I feel every day a lot of actual gratitude for the people I get to work with and really the shoulders that I feel like I stand on. In talking about like Glenn and how he talks with communities, that job, there's training to be able to do that. I think the way that I learned was just sticking my foot in it a lot. And getting that, feedback as well. But to some degree, it's that people are they've been more informed and they ask better, more directed questions that do make our job easier. So to specify what time frame that you need information, to specify what is the season of the most critical sensitivity for your species. If it's, the larval stage that they spawn in the spring, if it's when they are being transported and you're having, loss due to advection, and it's associated with these time. And people are more aware of that, and I think better able to communicate that, and that makes our job easier in gathering that kind of the vast amount of information and sensory input that we get to try to prioritize what we do each day. I think the hardest part of my job is setting priorities for myself every day, given the vast amount of really important and critical work that I could be doing. And so, yeah, making my job easier would maybe be to just stop the whole climate change thing, get the economy going, make sure that there are no vulnerable communities. But that's, yeah, it's hard to ask for any more support than we already have from this community to do that work.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer. And I'm glad it's just, just those little things, right? So Deborah, my question for you, my partner in crime, I have heard you talk about partnerships and how to make the magic in partnerships. And you inspired us all with your words in the past. I just want to give you some license to share some of that knowledge that you think is really key towards an effective partnership.
That's a great question. And a lot of partnership, I think, is born of necessity. As Emily just said, there's so much to do, and it's really challenging to prioritize, and resources are limited. The problems seem huge. And I think the beauty of partnerships is that you have more robust outcomes when you bring all the affected folks to the table. And so for me, partnership has always started by mutual respect. You don't have to agree, but mutual respect is sort of the foundation. The other thing that I'll say about partnership, and it's come up in the frame of working on behalf of society, and particularly with communities, is that it takes time. It takes more time to get something done in partnership than it does to do it yourself. And so there are real trade-offs to accomplishing your goals via partnership. But I do believe you end up with more robust and more sustainable outcomes and products if they're developed in partnership.
It's that great adage, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Yeah, very well captured. Connor, turning to you, and you are a tribal member. You're also a scientific researcher. And one of the questions that I get a lot is like, oh, every tribe is its own nation and it's so overwhelming. How do I start? And I just wonder if you could share some advice to people in terms of, effective ways to connect with tribes.
Yeah, so every tribe is so unique. So unique with the capacity they have, with the resources that they have, what their priorities are. For instance, in Southern California, I'm neighbor to some of the wealthiest tribes in the entire nation, on some of the most expensive real estate in the nation as well. Thinking, my homelands are in Orange County, Riverside, and San Diego County. If you drive a couple miles down the road where a gaming compact couldn't get signed because the road was too windy, folks don't have running water. Folks don't have electricity in their homes. And this is all while being 90 minutes from Los Angeles and 50 minutes from downtown San Diego. When you think of approaching one of those tribes, you could be working with a team of PhD researchers in the environmental department. And then you reach another tribe and there's absolutely nobody to talk to or to return your email or your phone call. Understanding that and all that comes between in that spectrum, that sort of individualized attention is why that's required. Because otherwise, as Deborah was pointing out, the folks that get left behind are the people that always get left behind, right? That don't have the resources to be at the table. So in developing really honest and genuine relationships and lending capacity when possible to the folks that need it is another way. Now I'm thinking about it, from 30,000 feet above as well, because what happens a lot of the time too, nationally and regionally, we get clumped together as Indigenous people, and we have very diverse differences across the board, politically, philosophically, and even in large large national initiatives. I'll give an example of, we saw it on a national stage with the National Academy of Sciences that dissolved their expert committee for grading Western and Indigenous science. How was there such a large failure for the National Academy of Sciences to work with a national team of Indigenous knowledge holders, academics, where they had to dissolve their expert committee? I don't want to speculate too much, but there was some historical, from my understanding and my perspective, it seemed like there was some historical power structures that couldn't be dissolved, right? But again, I don't want to speculate too much, but we saw on the national stage that between the Academy of Sciences and this large expert committee, they couldn't make that relationship and sort of make those compromises to work together. And some of the silver lining that I'm hoping that comes out of this is I thought it was really promising when we embarked on the project, is that we can learn from it. We can learn where those failure points were, what happened in the co-production of this project, where there was a failure point between such an esteemed academy and Indigenous scholars and knowledge holders where they couldn't work together. And I hope as this sort of it unfolds more and as time goes on that we'll really understand what that is so that we could all learn from it. I'm not sure if we're at time, but I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thanks, Connor. So now we're going to hear from the Slido. Nick, I see there's several questions. You want to just fire away?
Sure. And I just reminder, if you do log into the Slido with your phone here, you can vote on the questions that you like and ask questions away. I'm actually glad this one was voted to the top because I think it's a good follow-on to the last question here from Connor. But it's, where do you even start? And we get this all the time when we have these panels about engaging stakeholders. And it's, so how do you share that you're open for business and that your partnerships and you're ready to develop partnerships and co-develop projects? How do we let them know?
So just raise your hand if you want to comment on this question, or grab your microphone and just dive in. Emily, go.
Yeah, I might just call out like in Alaska, there's the Alaska Marine Science Symposium, and that meeting draws people from local communities, tribes, policymakers, managers, scientists, fisher people, and it's I mean, those opportunities, which are catalysts for face-to-face interaction and sharing ideas, I mean, that's a good, a great place to start is to just meet people face-to-face and to have that organized where there is a place to meet a diversity of people and engage in that conversation. And so sometimes those meetings, and not just scientific meetings, but that great community meeting can be a starting point.
Totally agree. There's also an organization called the National Working Waterfront Network. And that is a community that has fisher folk all the way to port managers and in between. So that would be another interesting place to gain some of that face-to-face and inform that community about the data resources and what can be happening. And I know that PCSGA has research priorities, and those are something that we look at every 2 years now, to identify what some of our challenges have been and where we need more information and help. And I think that through relationships and through that face-to-face interaction, sharing what some of the ideas you may all have and see how that resonates with our community would be beneficial. We often get sort of the last call on, hey, could you join a proposal on a research, and there's so much more that we could add to that in terms of the practical results and how they would be used. And so I think just kind of once you have that relationship, being open to working through those things.
I'll just add, I think it builds on what's just been said, go where they are. Right. Expecting them to come to you is generally not very effective unless there's a really big problem and you think they could help. So that sometimes happens. The other thing that has worked for us is leaning on our partners who are already working and engaging in these communities. My guess is most of y'all are familiar with the National Sea Grant Program and the Sea Grant Extension, the Estuarine Research Reserve. So these place-based programs where they already spend a good bit of time and are very knowledgeable about the communities around them have been a wonderful bridge for us and our work to get into these communities.
Connor, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So on a larger scale, there's places like the ITEP, the Tribal Environmental Professionals just had their large annual summit in Alaska at Anchorage. There's large events like that that are sort of good places to plug in to gain understanding of what tribal communities are doing. There's also the staff report that ITEP had produced to help fuel the national fifth assessment. That's a great document to understand who's doing what work and sort of all the diversity among the challenges of climate change throughout tribal communities. Other than that, communities are highly modular. Just in my experience of working in Southern California, from 5 minutes down the road to the next tribal community, a couple miles down the road, it's just constant presence. When I worked with Climate Science Alliance, we made it a mission to attend all public gatherings. If you go to a tribe's website, they used to have a calendar of events. A lot of them say open to the public. That's your invitation to come introduce yourself. It's probably on a Saturday and it's not covered during your normal work week. It's going to take an extra effort. And seeing your constant presence, understanding that you're going to be there year after year, even if you show up that time without an agenda, goes miles. Understanding the complex histories of whose homeland you're on goes leaps and bounds. Growing up in my homelands from, elementary school through university, the lack of knowledge of the histories of California, and a lot of the burden of working with tribal communities, your tribal partners are burdened with sort of holding people's hands through those histories, which isn't a burden that we signed up for, nor do we want to do, re-experiencing the trauma of our families, of our grandparents and our parents, but it's something that really sets everything back. It's a big roadblock, and it really deters from any partnerships being developed. So coming to the table with knowledge of the histories of a geographical area is really profound. Understanding the tribes' names, how they identify themselves, is the doors get kicked wide open. And a lot of the time that knowledge isn't there, and it's really hard to sit down and share your community's vision for the future, share data, collaborate and work together when you're talking about a geographical area where nobody understands the histories, nobody acknowledges them. And those small sort of nudges and changes that I think that we all should be making, that that extends to anywhere you are in the world, right? Really go leaps and bounds as far as developing relationships.
Thank you for those wise words, Connor. Nick, over to you. Cue up the next question.
Okay. And we'll also take questions from the audience too.
Hi, my name is Dev. I'm from University of South Alabama. So I'm sort of representing the Alabama-Mississippi region. And I have a question to our panelists, especially to Glenn, about the use of CTD in fishing vessels. So one of the challenges we are facing is the cost and the funding. So how sort of cost effective is that to give CTDs to the fishing vessels, as well as like get the data back? And the follow-up question is that what kind of CTDs will be it? Like, we cannot give them winch-based CTDs, like it should be an easy to use one, right? So the question is, why? The question is that in our region, the shrimp, oysters, and fishing industry is very big. And we have this event in summer where we conduct sort of a fishing rodeo, and we collect the fisheries management data set from that. And that would be a time we can use those kind of opportunities and bring back the data. And in terms of the science, that's the time we see the shelf hypoxia events, as well as the beginning of the active hurricane season. So those CTD data will be very useful, which we cannot usually go there and collect sometimes due to the workforce vessel limitations. So yeah, thanks.
That is a great question. So the Shelf Research Fleet uses RBR CTDs there. And the really critical technological advancement or at the start was that it had wireless data download so that the fishers didn't have to connect wires, unscrew caps and do things like that. So that when the CTD was brought on board the deck, the profile would plot on an iPad that we gave to them. So it's a fantastic question because we need to get more instruments out there. And there's two things that I can think of. So I was talking to some people from the Coastal Studies Institute in North Carolina, and they were funded recently. I think they got a grant for maybe $15,000 for citizen science CTDs there. And these are on the order of several $100s there, and they assembled them themselves. I think they made 15 of them on the first batch, and I offered to buy one myself to give to a local young fisherman there. But I think that the citizen science opportunities are really going to be broadening because I think the RBR is at $21,000 now, the order that we got. And Svenja Ryan actually also just ordered some for a new fleet with the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance. But I was kind of amazed too. There's an instrument called the Planktoscope. That's an optical instrument that actually takes imagery of plankton, and they have a cell phone app that actually does the classification there. And that's only, I think, like $4,000, something like that. And so what I'm hoping is that more of these citizen science opportunities are going to come up. And if we can have a larger scale with these, sounds like there's tremendous opportunities if you can get, 24 CTDs there. A great question.
Yeah, I might just add to that a comment. There are different models for doing this, and in the coastal system, sometimes the signal is big enough that you don't need high precision instruments, and that can affect the affordability. And also, there's models, a partnership at UAF where for repeat transects, then they're paying for the data collection. And then there's also models where there's co-development and partnership where they're collecting data where they're fishing anyway. And so the cost is in the instrumentation. And so there are a lot of different successful models for doing this, and the cost is going to vary based on the parameters. But I think leaning on your community members to see trial and errors for instrumentation and for design, not to reinvent the wheel, but to build out a community of practice for this would be a good step forward.
Okay, yeah, no, and I think this next question is a good contrast to that, Emily. So this one's about hyper-local climate signals, not hyperactive kids, Glenn. How important is it from your experience to break down climate signals to a hyper-local level to reach local communities? For example, is it a different signal each time? Are we working with them on very discrete things? Or has anyone ever done anything like that in the audience too?
I think it depends on the person and the decision being made. I'll just give a couple personal examples. I'm the tree hugger in my family. I have 4 brothers. And every time it's colder than they expect, they'll go, oh, there's climate warming for you. So it's a huge challenge. And I've forgotten the other point I was going to make, but I'll give an example. from one of my communities that, or one of my partners' communities, I should say, about where's the decision-making happening. Some of you may be aware that the Corps of Engineers does these big coastal studies to help drive infrastructure and coastal protection decision-making. And they're doing one in Charleston. And one of our vulnerable communities there was told by their, and they're just a small enclave in the bigger city of Charleston, by the leadership, that the Corps of Engineers model said their community didn't flood. And you could literally walk down the streets and see watermarks on their houses. And so this is a place where we now have a water level gauge. And one of the things that one of their community leaders says is that we're using this data to make noise, to convince decision makers that there is a problem. Now, is that a climate signal? Probably not. But to answer the question, I think you need to know, to answer the question about the scale, you need to know what decision needs to be made. There are regional fisheries managers that need one scale, and there are community members that need another scale.
And I think one thing really quick before I pass to Glenn, I just want to say connections, helping people to see connections. And in that case, you know, like that particular event, no. But the fact that these might be more and more commonplace and making that connection. Glenn.
So hyperlocal is really interesting, and I just want to give two examples. So when I was in Chatham 3 weeks ago, I was talking to the folks at the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance, and they said that a local lobsterman actually had the best day he'd had in 3 or 4 decades. And the very next day, he didn't catch a single lobster. And so, you know, there's probably a frontal movement, and this is probably related to that 3 to 5 degrees C cold anomaly that came through. But a lot of these impacts are just very, very local, and the local community knows the bathymetry, the tidal variations, all these really subtle things that the models may or may not actually have there. The second one actually is from about 15 years ago, and there was something called the Butterfish Smackdown, where the people from Rutgers University got together with their numerical model to see if the modelers and the upwelling in the model could be a better guide to catching fish than the captains. So they went out on Chris Roebuck's vessel. They pointed to a place to go to. They went there and they didn't catch any butterfish. And Chris moved the vessel 200 meters and filled the nets. And he was going off of like the bottom type or something like that. And so I think that that is one of the really critical connections that need to be made, is that in a lot of the local communities, things are really, really subtle on those hyper-local scales there. And we need to think of taking that into account there. It's an opportunity.
Well, and I'll go back to something you said earlier in your presentation in the previous panel, Jan, about clarifying with audiences the assumptions and the limitations of the forecast and the information that is being presented can go a long way to helping to build trust and understanding about the scale of what we're able to do and not do because we don't have enough observations or knowledge or whatever.
Okay, yeah, well, I know we have a lot of early career participants in this workshop. Thank you very much. And they have spoken. They want to know how early career researchers can be involved in projects involving local and/or indigenous communities. And are there any volunteer opportunities that they can apply to? Funded.
So one thing that some of the graduate students have gotten involved in are these weekly Squid Squad meetings. And they're open to any participants there. We generally have between 20 and 30 people, but I'm going to say we probably have anywhere from 5 to 10 students that are listening every week. And so they get to hear, all this latest information about the fishing community. And I would say this is, to me, one of the sources of optimism I have is the interest of students, postdocs, and early career scientists in wanting to have science that has a socioeconomic impact there. And some of the students in our joint program with MIT are starting to take classes at Harvard Law School and are starting to try and get more sophisticated about some of the legal economic frameworks there, which I'm always very, very encouraging of. I should also add that the Woods Hole Oceanographic now has a tribal liaison. And we're trying to start a new program for traditional ecological knowledge. And I'm very pleased that I have a new PhD student who's starting, Grace Jensen, who's a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from her. And she has been a member of the Squid Squad for 2 years.
Margaret, go for it.
Shellfish farmers are, of course, full of pride in what they do, and early career scientists and students certainly welcome to come and visit. If you're not on the West Coast, I can put you in contact with my counterparts on the East and the Gulf Coasts, so you have that opportunity. But understanding sort of where they're coming from and what they're observing will be of education to you, but also having you really see what the value is of what you do for them is also something that would be beneficial. So don't be shy.
One of the things I heard on an earlier question that I think is really pertinent to answering this is, like you mentioned, the Alaska Symposium. Connor mentioned, going to a tribe's website, finding where there's a public event. It's just showing up. And you don't need to go there with a proposal idea in mind, right? Go there to listen. And a lot of times you strike up a conversation, and that's how a lot of really good ideas start. And so I just encourage showing up, I think is a really important thing that can lead to all sorts of discoveries. So maybe you wouldn't have had Grace as your student if she hadn't been part of the Squid Squad, right? So those little, I don't know, Dan called them happy accidents. I think that there's a lot for that.
We have several more questions, but I know we're out of time, and I can run these by you at lunch, and those of you who are not anonymous, we can get back in touch with you to answer these.
I think the key is everybody, the panelists, I encourage you to look at the questions that are there, but also if you posed a question and it didn't get answered in our 90 minutes, please seek out a person where you might want to strike up a conversation to get an answer to what you posed. And so I just thank you, Nick, for helping me with Slido. So glad you were able to step in. And I really want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much. It's just been a really rich conversation. So let's give a shout of applause.